That was great, and appreciate everyone indulging us with that. I think Mr. Coe's remarks set the stage quite well for the next conversation, where I'm also pleased to welcome another former co-chair, as was Kemba, not former, co-chair rather. Sorry, you're former.
Once
Chris.
you're in,
you
you never get out.
Yes, no, you never get out if you haven't heard that theme. Chris Painter to welcome the Deter panel. Thank you.
Recognize that? I think it's fair use. So, well, I wanted to, I thought that was a great introduction. With all due respect to my friend David Coe and that introduction, I suggested we get Kiefer Sutherland as the keynote, but I guess it wasn't available or too expensive for the IST budget. Look, you know, I think it was great to hear the disruption panel. And when we were drafting the report, I remember Kemba and I often talking and saying, you know, disruption and deterrence kind of go hand in glove. And you even heard that from some of the panelists there. And so I think what we'll talk about today will certainly have some good overviews and connections with what we heard before. And I have a really great group of panelists here to talk about this. By the way, I'd share what Kemba said, that you know, Phil, when he asked me to do this, my major concern was the report not become shelfware, and we had the Colonial Pipelines attack like 2 weeks after we released it, so it didn't become shelfware. And hopefully these update reports don't become like a library of shelfware. We actually have some action, and that's what we really want to generate by these conversations. So let me welcome to the stage our panelists. Jennifer Bachus from the Department of State, Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau. Jennifer, good to see you. Álvaro Azofra Martínez from the European Cybercrime Center, EC3 at Europol. There you are. Clarke from the National Security Council. David Moreno from the OAS, Organization of American States. And finally, Jeff Morris from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I've been asked to tell you all to not grip your mics at the bottom because that's where the transmitters are apparently. So, I think, you know, we've had a lot of progress. Some of the major issues in the original report were raising this as a real policy priority. You know, over all the competing policy priorities of their time, there's a lot of focus then and now on nation state activity, but this was just as disruptive and problematic. And one of the things we said, we need to raise that level. We also talked about the problem of safe havens. That still persists, and we'll get into some of that discussion now. And it's become even harder because Russia being one of the primary safe havens, it's very difficult to really leverage any more against Russia than we're already doing for Ukraine and some of the other activities. But still, it's important. And we talked about the need for better international cooperation. You heard in the last panel, there's been some really good cooperation on that, but there could be more. And that's some of the things that we want to discuss here today with this great group of folks. I wanted to first turn to Jennifer. And, you know, one of the key actions that the Ransomware Task Force highlighted was incentivize cooperation and proactive action in resource-constrained countries. And part of the rationale was this, what I was just talking about safe havens. There are countries who don't want to cooperate, and like Russia. There are others who would probably want to cooperate, but they just don't have the resources or capabilities. And so capacity building, working with those countries is critically important. And one of the many things that the State Department and the CDP Bureau does is it's really been in the forefront of this capacity building. So I wanted to ask how the Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau at State is addressing ransomware, you know, and as a part of a broader effort to deter malicious actors in cyberspace. So obviously this is one part of that larger effort, but I'd like to hear what you guys are doing.
Thanks, Chris, and very excited to be here. Great to be on a panel with you. It is a little weird because essentially I have been tasked with taking on the mantle of much of the work that Chris pioneered in the State Department. Luckily, he seems pretty happy with how we're going, so I consider that to be a vote of confidence, which is critically important. Look, I like to say that ransomware is probably the issue that most countries in the world care about. We have spent a lot of time, of course, addressing state-sponsored cyber intrusions through the UN and other organizations. But to be honest, a lot of people don't want to pick a side, right? As you said, they don't want to say they're for or against, they are siding with the United States or siding with the PRC. But you know what they will say? We don't want ransomware actors attacking our critical infrastructure, going after our e-government systems, taking down our businesses. So it does seem to be the area where you can grow sort of the big tent approach to this and say, look, this is the issue you're interested in, and let's see how we can help you. Because one of the things we believe in the Bureau is the critical element that, or the critical role that digital infrastructure can play in terms of job creation, in terms of bringing economic prosperity around the world. But what we don't want is we connect a place that's been unconnected, we improve these things, we bring on their e-government services, and then immediately they get hit with a massive ransomware attack. Because let's be clear, it's usually ransomware attacks and not state-sponsored attacks. There's some examples of state-sponsored, Albania is one, but really ransomware is the scourge that most countries are facing. And so, you know, it's funny, it's not a ransomware, but I was talking to a friend of mine is posted as our ambassador in the Pacific, and she said, so it's great, we brought connectivity to this Pacific island, and then all the grandmas started clicking on all the links and the entire system went down. So I think and she said, so next Pacific Island you connect, can you please like start doing basic cyber security at the outset? Because it's easier than coming and trying to fix it. So we are working to do that. We integrate it into the work we do, which is why the Bureau was created, was to bring together these threads of, you know, connectivity, digital infrastructure with cybersecurity and with digital freedom. We are really excited because Congress has embraced the role that we're trying to play. And they did recently both authorize and appropriate a new cyber, digital, and related emerging technology fund to the tune of $50 million. Now, we're so excited. This actually is a massive bump in our base capacity building. Is it enough? No. Are the needs way outstripping that? Yes. But it's amazing to be able to think ahead and to plan about what we can do with $50 million. So what we're doing is exactly what you said. It's as you bring in connectivity, working with countries around the world to build up their own capacity. Do they have a national cyber strategy? Do they have a SOC? If not, how can you work with them to do that? Ultimately, the US government isn't going to have all the tools in the toolbox, which is why it's so great that this conference is a public-private partnership, because a lot of the tools are going to remain in the private sector, and that's something we always make a strong point on. We can give you the tools, the procedures, talk about how you recruit the people, but ultimately the technology is going to come from the private sector, and the technology is a piece of this overall people, process, technology question. I could keep going on and on, but I don't want to actually hog all of the time. So
I'm going to try to have some time for questions and answers, but thanks for that. And it's, you know, hard to overstate how important getting that funding is, because I remember when I was there having to borrow, beg, and steal from different pots of money. Not steal much, but, you know, at least beg and borrow. You know, you couldn't really be very reactive. You couldn't really prioritize and do something. So getting that pot of money, although not enough, I agree, I think is a real watershed thing for really the Bureau and really this whole area. Let me turn to you, Álvaro, next. We heard in the last panel about law enforcement cooperation, and certainly something we highlighted in the Ransomware Task Force report was this need for better cooperation. There's been some really good cases out there, certainly, and I'd say, you know, Europol has been really on the forefront. When we were writing the report initially, Europol was doing a lot of stuff. I mean, they were taking it seriously back then, and that was great. I think you were kind of an unofficial member in the background of some of our deliberations. So, you know, tightening the noose, making sure criminals get caught, there's consequences for them, and the kind of disruption and deterrence stage. So the deterrence part of that is if you keep doing that, you do that well, maybe they won't do it anymore. At least they'll think twice about it, or they'll go for an easier target. How is Europol supporting investigations that, you know, in your area in the EU that are targeting EU citizens? And that may, and this is often the case, I know from my law enforcement background here, or prosecutor background, they're often the perpetrators are not in the EU, they're outside of it, or they might be in one of these safe haven countries.
Thank you very much for the floor. First of all, thank you for having me here in representation of Europol. It's very important for us to be here and to cooperate with you in the International Engagement Working Group. So answering your question, I think that one of the superpowers of Europol is the liaison bureau network that we have in our building that basically is composed by more than 40 countries physically present in one building, with representatives from law enforcement agencies from the country, from competent authorities from law enforcement. That facilitates us to basically step physically some rooms away or some floors away and start deconflicting and clarifying what is the next step in order to reach or to break that wall that it's impeding in terms of jurisdiction in your operation. So that's I think that one of the key points that that we have, that physical presence. In the end, we are humans and we live in the digital age, but in the end, it's very much useful to be here sitting than to have a video conference to discuss any problem. So you have that on a daily basis. That is what is facilitating all the investigations we support at Europol. Moreover, in the cybercrime world at EC3, in the European Cybercrime Center, we have what is called the Joint Cybercrime Action Task Force, JCAT, which is where 20 countries are represented by 26 different law enforcement agencies, and they work together, not just in the same building, but in the same room. So on a daily basis, those 26 agencies are working together, prioritizing cases for their own countries, but at the same time, that affect the other members of the JCAT. This helps us really in an incredible way to further all kinds of investigations that are priority for the US, for Canada, for any of the members represented in this permanent task force, and therefore breaking those barriers that in jurisdiction otherwise it would be impossible, or we would have to use the traditional means of external request, MLAT, and things like that. As well, we have these joint investigation teams that are agreements between judicial authorities, and therefore we can sort out the exchange of cross-border evidence in a much efficient way. And of course, the work and the targeting of criminals that are sitting in foreign jurisdictions. In some cases, we have. I remember one case that in order to seize some infrastructure in Ukraine and arrest, we actually rely on US and a US prosecutor in order to start that request. For us, support, of course, EU member states, FBI colleagues, I think that were present as well, and Ukrainian police in order to seize that infrastructure in Ukraine. So all this cooperation internally, it's sometimes leveraging who is stronger in what country, if it's especially out of the EU, and after going that way, channeling that support and definitely being more effective when it comes to disruption of technical infrastructure, or as well the arrest of suspects.
I mean, and it sounds like you have those non-EU countries, some of the key ones, practically on the floor with you, helping you with this, which is really great. And I think that collaborative environment is really important. And it sounds like that's grown significantly over even the last year in terms of the operational tempo.
Yes, I think that we are being much more efficient. You just have to check the Europol's website to see all the actions that we have supported during the last months. In 1 year, we have targeted some of the most prolific ransomware families, Locker, Goga, Ragnar Locker, Hive, and just a few months ago, Lockbit. So is it the right way? Yes. Is enough? No. But definitely we are doing this because of better strategy, like counter-ransomware initiative, in our case, the international ransomware response model. We have a new and agreed way of targeting and investigating ransomware cases, identifying high-value targets, identifying key enablers and service and facilitators in the cybercrime world, which has become so professionalized that we cannot take them for granted anymore. Like before, they were clumsy, they were making mistakes. Now it's not the case because they are really good at what they do. So we really needed to have to catch up in this regard and keep doing and working hard in that way.
Interesting. Yeah, I think obviously we always used to say it's a cat and mouse game. The criminals get smarter. There's always good dumb criminals. You love dumb criminals, but there's too many smart ones. So really appreciate that. David, within your region, within the OAS, within Latin America, there have been some really high-profile ransomware incidents. Obviously, country ones, other ones that targeted major systems. Do members of the OAS, and I know it's not everyone is at the same level, I get that, see ransomware as a priority? And what are some of the things they're doing and you are working with them to address it?
Yes, thank you, Chris, for your question. Thank you for having me here. The OAS has been working with member states to improve their capabilities regarding cybersecurity for 20 years. So I think we have in a very good position to see how these things is evolving in the region. As you said, first thing I would like to know to let you know is that the different countries have different levels of maturity. So the region, not all countries in the region are at the same in the same stage, but we're seeing a lot of progress. And of course, ransomware is one of the priorities in the countries when we talk about the cybersecurity. But back in 2016, when we first published our report on the state of cybersecurity in Latin America and the Caribbean, just 6 countries had national cybersecurity policies in place. Now in 2024, 21 countries have this kind of policy, which is an improvement. Countries are also working in developing cybercrime legislation so that they can prosecute criminals. Some of them have joined the Budapest Convention. I think there's 9 countries in the region who have joined the Budapest Convention, plus 5 that are observers. Where OAS member states have also agreed to 11 CBMS norms that further the UN responsible state behavior framework to prevent conflict in the cyberspace. The CRI, there's 11 countries who have already joined the CRI. We are working with IST in 2 specific countries to actually to develop this ransomware task force to adapt it to these countries. So yeah, there's a lot that has been done, and there's a progression, and of course ransomware is a top priority in the region. I'd say there's still some challenges. The first, in my opinion, that we have in the region is institutionalization. Like cybersecurity still depends a lot on the people and not that much on the institutions. And let me explain this. Like after we have democracies in the region, so after 4 or 5 years, we have new governments in place. And the new administration might or might not have cybersecurity as a priority. It is true that is changing, but it's still the case. So what we're trying to transfer is that cybersecurity is not that much about a politician, but about the civil servant. And for that, we need to build capacity in those civil servants so that the knowledge and the awareness remains in the institutions, and it doesn't, and the workflow doesn't change even if the government change. So that's an important challenge that we're seeing in the region. And the other very important challenge is resources. When we were preparing the panel, we're talking about the progress report and say, well, we've done a lot, but we need to do 10 times more. We wish we could do that much in the region. There's not that many resources. It's true that we've advanced. I said before, most of the countries now have strategies and policies in place, and now we're working towards the implementation. We're working to translate these lines of actions, these activities that are written in the strategies. We're trying to transform them into public investment projects, which is challenging. Someone in the panel before talked about to build cyber resilience in critical infrastructure, you need cyber threat intelligence. Well, that costs money. What we've done from the OAS, we've created the CISR Americas network, which is the biggest regional network of CISRs that provides information on threats 24/7, but we also provide technical assistance to strengthen the CSIRT associated to strengthen their services, and we also provide we channel our training through them. But most important thing is we're creating a community of technical experts that we can pull from and get their services in the case we need it. It was very impressive how in 2022, when the Costa Rica ransomware attack happened, we had an urgent call with all these head of CSIRTs, more than 40, and everyone responded, and everyone put their services to their capacity and skills to help Costa Rica, and we were able to coordinate that. So that was awesome. That is a little bit our philosophy of work. Like we try to gather the right people at the right time. That's why we're the GFC hub for the Americas, because we have this convening power, and we know we've been working in the region for 20 years, so we know the main actors, we know the country needs, so that we can tailor the best practices, international best practices, to the specific needs of the countries in the region.
Great. I'm curious because for years, I mean, Michael and many of us in this room had been arguing that cyber had to be a real, no kidding, national security priority and not one of 12,000 priorities. And ransomware, I think, really changed that for the US and for other countries. You mentioned countries changing administrations and maybe cybersecurity wouldn't be a priority. Has ransomware made that easier to make this a priority for you guys?
Yes, definitely. And because now ransomware attacks have, the Costa Rica attack, which just affected Costa Rica, but then we had the Guacamaya that affected Chile, Mexico, and different countries. So that helped us. I mean, the best awareness raising campaign is an attack. I'm sorry, it is the trigger.
Never don't take advantage of a crisis.
That is what triggers in most of the cases. It is true that that's not true anymore. When I spoke about the number of countries putting in place strategies, we see that those strategies are changing, and some countries are on their second and third iteration, and the strategies at the beginning were more reactive, like they would react to attacks in the case of, and now they're more proactive. So what can we do? Would they work more in the building an ecosystem, like building capacity, developing workforce, cybersecurity workforce? So you can see that there's a change on that.
And Jennifer, before I move to our other panelists, there was one question I wanted just to hit you on that, which is it also seems to be, and there's a lot of reasons for this, but there seems to be, because of ransomware and the priority, that more countries are establishing cyber diplomats. It seems like that's been a growing trend. Has that been your experience?
Well, I would say there's definitely a growing trend of cyber diplomacy as a sort of line of work. I think ransomware is part of it. I think the work in the UN is part of it. I think the question of digital economies is part of it. Every country takes every country takes a slightly different approach to the topic. But what you see is that we are actually in the midst of massive negotiations over the Global Digital Compact, right? So that's the next UN iteration, as Chris well knows. What does that look like? You got to have diplomats that can go and engage on these, who have to understand, how technology works, how digital works, how cyber works. So what we're seeing is, I think for some countries, it's ransomware that has created the desire. For some countries, it's state intrusions. For some countries, it's digital. For some countries, it's information integrity, which would be more in our digital freedom unit. So it's a little bit of everything is what we're seeing. And a lot of countries are now coming to us and saying, like, okay, explain to us how you're organized. Maybe we need to organize in the way you all have organized, because there's some sense to bringing all those strands together. So between Nate and I think we're now like briefing nearly every country we go to on how it is that we're organized and why it makes sense. But the last thing actually is we shouldn't underestimate also the power of we, the OAS, and others have also been working to train other foreign ministries on why what we do matters. So if there wasn't the sort of, grassroots level, we need to work on this. There is a little bit, we'll acknowledge, of a US push, right? So we have for many years trained diplomats around the world to participate in these topics because and maybe this is, very reflective of the US view. We believe that people just understand our point of view, they'll agree with us. Now, one could have a whole debate about whether or not that's an actual good foreign policy strategy, but that is generally our foreign policy strategy. So the idea is if you train cyber diplomats and then they go into the open-ended working group, they're more likely to understand what's actually being said, to engage in a way that's constructive and ultimately lead to a better outcome. So I think there is a whole line of work. We actually have our second cohort of a State Department emerging leaders in international cyberspace security coming to Washington next week. And I can just tell you one quick story is, so we trained somebody in this program last year from Costa Rica. And when I went to Costa Rica, she said to me, I really want you to spend time with my boss to explain why a foreign ministry should care about this topic. Because to go back to your national security, this woman did all international security issues. So you're talking about non-proliferation, you're talking about a whole export controls, all of this. And she's like, can you explain to her why these things matter and why Costa Rica should have a stronger voice internationally on these issues? So of course, it was easy for me to do because we align so closely with Costa Rica. We'd love for them to be a stronger voice. So it's just to say that there is also some external effort to sort of grow this cadre of people so that ultimately there is, those voices from a diversity of countries, because otherwise what's going to happen is if there's either the reality or the perception that international policies are only being written by the big guys, the smaller players aren't going to actually implement them or sign on to them. So we really do need that diversity of voices to come to a best policy outcome. Thanks.
Well, David, that's a good I'm sorry, Jeff, that's a good lead into the question for you, our friend in the North. Raising public awareness about the threat is a key piece of the deter effort, obviously. Specifically, we calling for a sustained aggressive public-private campaign, a collaborative anti-ransomware campaign. How is Canada approaching engaging partners, both internationally, but also non-government partners? And what do you see from your counterpart law enforcement agencies that has been particularly effective?
Thanks, Chris. And good day, everyone. Happy to be here. Jeff Morris, I'm with the RCMP National Cybercrime Coordination Center, NC3. Essentially, we borrow from EC3 and IC3 on those terms. We're happy to learn from others. But we're essentially a coordination hub within the RCMP, working closely with investigative teams in Canada and internationally to fight cybercrime, including ransomware.
You have a virtual horse. You don't have an actual horse.
No, not yet. So as a foundational piece, before public-private partnerships, we had to work more across the Canadian law enforcement community. So police-to-police partnerships. And part of that is there's a relatively short history in a Canadian context in terms of fighting cybercrime from a law enforcement perspective. So over 10 years ago, when I was a younger analyst, I started looking at ransomware and total victim losses in Canada reported to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre at that time. It's around 15,000 Canadian dollars, and I may be rounding up. And we knew we were dealing with a different thing back then, very individualized. There was some law enforcement imitation ransomware, maybe still some instances of, gift cards, prepaid cards being used. Fast forward to today, we do have dedicated investigative capacity at federal, provincial, major municipal levels. We have a dedicated national mechanism, the NC3. And now in terms of the work that we see, operational requests for assistance, we get around 1,500 a year and 30 to 50% directly relate to ransomware. So our first step was defining that operating framework within a Canadian policing context and learning how to level up and play ball with our international law enforcement partners in particular. And we've done that over the years compared to the past. You know, we've been able to rack and stack some wins where we look at takedown pages and splash pages, and we're seeing more of the Canadian flag and the RCMP logo and the logo of some of our close partners. Take a lot of pride in that. We've used that success, learning from our international partners. So, you know, we talked already about joint sequenced operations and Lockbit and Hive and some other case studies. And we use that to then look inward within Canada and build trust-based relationships with industry. And to better define the value proposition of working with police, because there is still a lot of antiquated notions of, well, you try to catch bad guys and the bad guys are not here. So what are we talking about? But when we got into the variety of these case studies and the different aspects of the playbook, we ended up having more pro-law enforcement partners. Learning from our partners, again, we really liked the EC3 advisory group model of focusing on financial services, communication service providers, internet security, detection and response companies. We work with law firms and insurance carriers a lot. So a lot of key industry partners that have a role to play in cyber incident response. And we've better engaged them at a strategic level using those success stories. Where we want to go from here is much earlier participation with the key industry partners at earlier stages within operations. So more of an integrated approach. We're not there yet, but we want to get there over time through both pre and post incident analysis. So we're investing more in operational exercises. So tabletop functional exercises, which can be humbling, but that's the point. You go over your pain points and we find out what to improve, but also post-incident analysis. So when it comes to these wins that we're seeing, you know, where we do feel and we demonstrate there's a material impact on the cybercrime environment, we want to work with industry so that they can red team that a bit and say, okay, that's great, that went well, but if we were to rewind the play tape and do it again, if you worked more with us in a Canadian context, we could have accelerated and expanded on your victim notification efforts. Maybe we could have got that decryption capability to more organizations. Maybe there was a preventative angle working with banks that we did not consider. So that's where we want to take things.
Right. Well, Caitlin, let me turn to you. You're batting cleanup here. And so, you know, Kemba said many times during her panel how excited she was about certain things. And I just say that one of the things that I didn't think was going to happen, and we said this when we had the Ransomware Task Force, that this is going to take a sustained effort. Governments are not great at doing sustained efforts. They're good for doing like a 6-month effort, then moving to the next problem. But, you know, it has been a sustained effort. And I think the White House has been doing a lot really to lead that. So how is the White House organizing counter-ransomware efforts, both across the US government and with international partners? And what are some of the lessons you've learned in taking a whole of government, as we always say, a whole of society, but really a whole of globe approach to dealing with this?
Thanks, Chris. And I'm looking forward to batting cleanup. Big baseball fan. Just to follow on a lot of what my fellow panelists have said, we view from the Biden administration ransomware as a national security priority for us. It's been included in the national cybersecurity strategy that Kemba so eloquently drove in her previous position. And what we're doing is it really is top of mind on a week-to-week basis for the administration. We have weekly meetings with the interagency to talk about the incidents that are occurring across the country, across the globe, so we can understand what are the root causes of those incidents. Is there something that we can learn from these? Can we forewarn others in industry so that they don't get impacted by the same? I heard on the previous panel a lot of conversation about we still see CVEs being the root cause of many of these attacks. So understanding what those are, getting that out more broadly, and from a using every tool in the toolbox approach, looking at what can we do to shore up the cyber defenses of our critical infrastructure. As Director Coe said, that's got to be one of our pillars of our approach, and that's been something that we have really focused on as in the administration. You know, we post-colonial pipeline with the pipeline sector, aviation, rail, just this past winter with the maritime transportation sector and ports. And, you know, we're looking at post-change healthcare, what can we do in the healthcare sector? What are those minimum requirements? What are those minimum standards that we should expect to have across our healthcare sector? I think Director Coe also mentioned this, but in the US, we have been tracking 128% increase in ransomware attacks against the healthcare sector from 2022 to 2023. That's not sustainable. And I am a mother of 3. When I go to the doctor to get treatment for my children for the, they fell on the ice, sorry, my friend north of the border, and got skated over, I got to get some stitches, and I want to make sure that the healthcare services are available. And this is a global problem. We've seen over 86% over time from 2022 to 2023 globally when it comes to targeting of healthcare sector. So when we look at what are we doing domestically, we're bringing in more people to talk about this. It's not just our traditional intelligence community and law enforcement partners in the room. We're bringing in the sector risk management agencies. Those departments and agencies understand their sector and understand what the technology means, what the potential impacts are, and what some of the policy solutions may be to mitigate the impacts of a ransomware attack while our law enforcement partners are working on the response. And our private sector partners are also engaged in the incident response. We need to bring that more internationally. This is not just, we understand this cannot be a US only approach. As Jennifer said, we need to bring more people along on this, and ransomware has been a conversation that we've been able to have with multiple governments. It's been on the agenda, I think, with every meeting we have as international delegations come in. As Director Coe said, last year we put out our first policy statement from the CRI about governments not paying ransoms. Is there something more we can do around this healthcare perspective? Can we look more multilaterally for multiple governments to say, healthcare is just unacceptable for ransomware actors to be targeting. And as a global community, we will not accept this. How do we do that? Where do we do that beyond the CRI? What other multilateral forums can we bring these kind of conversations to? I think what you'll also see is as we have delegations coming in, we just had the Japanese Prime Minister and the Philippines in, and you will see on all of our joint statements the focus on digital infrastructure and cybersecurity as being a commitment that we, the United States, are making with our partners globally. And it has been something that Pound Cyber, as we call ourselves at the NSC, is a functional director. We cover all of.
It's a symbol. It's not like Pound Cyber.
Yes, yes. That is very important. It is It is not. We are not pounding cyber on the table, but are we pounding cyber on the table as we work with our regional partners in the NSC, so we can bring them up to speed and they're tracking this, so that when we have these, bilateral visits or multilateral visits, that cybersecurity and digital technology and infrastructure is always on the table as we talk about it. So it has been a sustained thing from day one for the administration. We're still moving. We know we have room to grow, but we are looking for the partners in this room to help us along that journey.
It's because this was true. I remember when I was in the White House during the Obama administration, having a president that actually cares about the issue, not that they're going to do it full time. They have lots of other things on their plate. That always would get added to the agenda of high-level meetings between the president and their counterparts, and then all the way down the line. And that makes a tremendous signaling and other difference in keeping this a priority. So that's great. How big is the CRI right now? What's it up to?
I believe it's up to 61,
wow.
Which, in 3 years' time, that's a large growth for a new multilateral organization focusing on cybersecurity.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, it's not just the usual suspects, because there is, as you mentioned before, David, there's a collaboration there where people say, hey, these are not, we can all agree on this. This is something we want to deal with. And I've heard this from David Coe too, that, you're not pointing the finger at someone, you're going after people collectively. And that's a really good.
And it's about pointing out the impacts to the economy and to the services that people expect within government, right? Within countries. And that's conversation. It's not about necessarily who's doing this, but it's about why we need to ensure that cybersecurity is at top of mind, because our job is in the government is to ensure that services are available to our people, and we need to commit to that. And that is something that we're able to have those conversations around.
And I also like the fact that CRI is now adding some regional members, the Interpol is a member, Council of Europe is a member, my organization, the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise is a member, and I think that helps broaden the impact too. So that will be good to see how that tracks going forward.
Yes, and we are excited, for this year's CRI Summit, which will be in the fall, to continue to drive on a lot of these topics.
Right. All right. Thank you guys all. I don't know if you have any comments for each other, but first we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So I wanted to open the audience open it to the audience to ask if there are any questions. I see a hand back there. Being approached with a microphone.
Thank you. Jamie McCall from the Royal United Services Institute in London. Chris, you mentioned at the start the issue of safe havens and the fact that diplomatic relations with Russia have obviously made it harder to have any impact on that. But ransomware is a global problem, whether in Latin America or countries like South Africa or India that have much friendlier relations with Russia. Why do you think there hasn't been any, or maybe there has been and we don't know about it, any diplomatic activity between states that are friendlier with Russia to put some pressure on them to do something about the problem?
Anyone want to take that question? Caitlin, will you look like you're either want to, or Jennifer, or whoever was.
I'll start
defer
and
to the
then-
State Department.
Yeah. Well, I'll start, and then I think there is, what I'll talk about is collective action, and I'll let you talk about bilateral action. Look, I think especially so, as we try to build out the successor to the open-ended working group in the UN, and those of you who don't know it, don't worry, I didn't know a lot about it before I started in this. Chris can give you the tutorial, having lived through it for many years. But look, we've got to figure out where to go. And interestingly, Russia spends a lot of time saying we need a treaty, a cyber treaty, and to which we go, interesting. We don't think that's going to work. But we do say, okay, so we put on the table something we're calling the program of action, which is a more action-focused organization. And I do think there is a question for those countries that have better relations with Russia, who may be interested in a treaty, to say to them, okay, well, why don't you think about this way of addressing it instead through collective action, right? Through the UN, not through a treaty, but through something more action-oriented to get them in line to understand where the vulnerabilities are and how they can be addressed through a multilateral system. I think that's sort of the way we're going about it. There is a lot of discussion about how to push bilaterally on those with better relations. But again, maybe I'll let Caitlin try to answer that part.
I would just say, yes, we are thinking through ways that we can communicate. If it's not the US, who can have those open lines of communications to talk about what we see as a global problem, which, to be frank, a lot of it is emanating out of Russia. And so we may not be able to have those conversations effectively, but others may. And that is something that we consider when we look at, and when I say all the tools in the toolbox, that is something that we consider.
Yeah, and I agree with you. These actors just don't target the countries that Russia thinks are unfriendly. They target countries that they're trying to cater to. And to be frank, look, even before the Ukraine war, Russia wasn't exactly all that cooperative in law enforcement things, from as far as I can remember, for various reasons, corruption, state sponsor, whatever it is. So, but it's an interesting idea. I've heard that talked about before, but it's harder to execute, I think, than to say, but it's important. Other questions? Yeah. It's a hot table back there.
It's working. So I'm Michael Garcia. I'm with CISA. So one question I have is that obviously this whole panel is about deterrence, but at least in American think tanks, there's this notion that deterrence is not applicable in cyberspace or has failed. Indeed, there's a whole book on persistent engagement in which they say deterrence no longer exists. And so I'm curious as to, and I'm glad you're smiling. So I'm teeing up because it's very interesting to hear your perspectives as to why we should not give up on deterrence and how we can push back against the notion that deterrence in cyberspace is not worthwhile pursuing.
We could have an hour-long debate on that. I mean, me and Jim Lewis are on opposite sides of this issue. I do think deterrence is worth pursuing. And the mistake people make is they think deterrence means like nuclear deterrence. We're not talking that. You can still deter nation states and criminal actors.
I think we just need to make it harder. Like deterrence is making it harder and costlier for them to be able to be successful in their objective. And I don't think we should give up in trying to make it harder and costlier for them to be successful.
And I would say, you know, I'm working on the diplomatic angle, but I appreciate that we have the law enforcement angle because that is a huge element of deterrence, right? Like you go after our systems, we're going to arrest you to the extent that we can, right? We're going to find ways to impose costs on you. So there's the diplomatic angle, which is how do you call them out? How do you say, we see what you're doing, it's not acceptable, and we're going to say it's not acceptable that Russia offers safe havens, all this stuff. We're going to do all that. And ultimately, the greatest deterrence on crime is law enforcement.
Yes, I totally agree. Actually, I think that we have been learning the lesson in the last years. And before we were just focusing in the arrest and the takedown and maybe a splash page. That was our deterrence. And maybe a little bit limited now that we look into with perspective. Before it was like we never did that before. Before it was just takedown and nothing else. Now, for instance, with Lockbit, we have used new strategies like taking over the panel, the access to the criminal websites where they were shaming the victims and pressuring them with the timer. And now we were use the same model in order to pressure the criminals and the facilitators of the criminals and the affiliators of the criminals in order using exactly the same panel that they were using to pressure the victims with a timer. We were using exactly the same technique. This has a tremendous impact in the confidence of the different parts of the ransomware as a service, because they start thinking like, okay, if they have this capability to access all the information behind, how else or how more they know about me. So I think that this is an important fact that we don't have to forget. And also there are many other actions that we can take into the deterrence factor. For instance, the cyber offender prevention. At EU, we have created a new project that will last for 3 years, and it's oriented to cyber offender prevention. We are trying to target those future criminals that are not yet criminals. Maybe they are technically savvy people, youngsters, that they are good at computers. If they see an easy money in the ransomware ecosystem, they will quickly jump into that, getting some easy money, because we are saying constantly that it's very easy, it's low cost to become a ransomware criminal. So we are trying to stop them before they become that and actually bring them to the good side of the road to protect everybody from those actions.
It's a fair question, and I've had similar discussions and debates with federal colleagues in Canada, and it touches on your point, Chris, about, well, it depends how we're defining these terms and really who's asking. So sometimes even on the disruption end, I'll speak with some federal departments and they're only viewing it purely from a very discrete offensive point of view. And like, okay, we're not on the same page. Let's talk it through. It's fair recognizing that these different themes, these buckets that we're discussing throughout the day, there's logical overlap between them all, and there has to be. Picking up on offender prevention, I'm really glad you brought that up. We're investing in that too, working closely with international partners, where we all think of general prevention and hygiene as, cybersecurity, good things that we all want to do to increase the baseline. Offender prevention is more on the consequences and illegality. And we know we have a high level of user activity of curious individuals before they become hardened cyber criminals, and there's a lot of darknet activity there. So it's about types of engagement there, where it could be a lighter touch, but impactful to hopefully get them on the right path, and then in turn flip them and help with the cyber talent pipeline issue as well.
Almost like de-radicalization for crime, sort of. But yeah, so we need to wrap up. I just say, my experience, one of the things that works really well on criminal sides are these investigations, and particularly undercover investigations. the criminals can't trust other people in their own network, really undermines them, and it really deters them in the sense that they don't know, if they're going to be arrested the next day. Nation states harder, but even nation states, we have to have appropriate consequences to make sure that, they think twice. They may not be deterred from it if it's in their interest, but that's something that I think needs to be pursued too. So with that, I want to thank the panelists, this great group of panelists, this great discussion. A lot more to do here. I think the lesson is that lots of things are in process, but a lot more to do, as we pointed out in the update report that you all have access to now. And look forward to next year, where we are next year. I think there's been steady progress on a lot of these issues. So can you please thank all of our panelists for their discussion, and I'll turn it back to Mike.